Welcome to Sounds Like Portraits. I'm Philippe Ungar. This is another conversation with creative humans. Please visit soundslikeportraits.com, and if you like this show, don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or Google Podcast. And remember to leave us your comment and rating. It really helps new listeners find us. Thank you. This week, I meet Andrew Heinrich, who founded the nonprofit Project Rousseau when he was 19 years old in 2011 while an undergraduate student at Columbia University. The idea was, and still is, to provide underprivileged high school students with the opportunity of a college education. Since then, 100% of Project Rousseau students have faced chronic hunger, food insecurity, or housing instability. 18% of them have had involvement with the justice system, and 20% have experienced homelessness. To help them, Project Rousseau offers far more than academic preparation. Students are matched one-to-one to a mentor who are college student volunteers. And because academic problems rarely have only academic causes, Project Rousseau takes a holistic approach. It delivers not only mentoring but also community service programs, international cultural exchanges, and of course, academic support. And it works. In the past 5 years, Project Rousseau students achieved 26 Ivy League acceptances and received 99 acceptances to top 25 colleges. So, mentorship is at the core of Project Rousseau. What makes a good mentor? That's the question of the week. Listen to Andrew's answer, but before, he told me what he tried to do all his life.
All my life, I've always tried to be helpful, and it's really that simple. It's just about being helpful to those who want help and who could benefit from help.
But when did it start?
I think to some degree it might be innate. I remember from early childhood hearing stories about how my family came to America after the Holocaust and thinking about people who must have helped along the way, even if I don't know their names or their precise stories, that there were people who just helped. And, one of my childhood heroes, I remember he had a saying on television. It was Mr. Rogers. And he used to say, whenever you saw the bad things on television, look for the helpers because there'll always be helpers. So I find that very compelling and try and be one myself if I can, and also try and cultivate other helpers.
But it's not so easy to help. What does it require to be a good helper?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one of the things that is most difficult to describe is a sort of detachment that's required. In my case, it's often because someone else is in an even more perilous situation. And I think to remember that, I'm here because I can be helpful in this situation to someone whose situation is dire. I was once with a public relations person who had come to interview me, and she was doing something for a firm that supports us, and they wanted to put something on their website about their grant to us. And she asked, if you wanted to give a motto that explained yourself to adults, what would your motto be? And it was, if not us, then whom?
So tell me more about you, because you're a big helper and a modest person at the same time. You're less than 30 years old. You're a student at Harvard Law School. How did you get involved in educational issues?
Yeah, so I really have only 3 things that interest me in life. It's in this order of importance: helping people, learning new things, and sports, if I had a third. Of the first 2, I never really, admittedly, when I was younger, realized that they could be one and the same. So I liked helping people as I could, and I'm talking about as a young child or volunteering at a soup kitchen, something that's age appropriate at that point. And I loved learning new things. And then it was that I realized that education was the way to marry those 2 passions. And it was that simplistic, and there was something parsimonious about it, that I could do 2 of the things I loved at the same time. It started first with tutoring and being helpful on a one-to-one or a small group basis. And then I grew really interested in transitions. Transitions are often the most understated part of a young person's life and of an adult's life. Be it a traditional high school student going to college, there's a lot of new environmental considerations that go into that. And similarly, even for, again, a traditional high school student who comes from a comfortable background, starting a new school, or, adjusting to changed financial circumstances, or, the death of a family member is really, really difficult. And if you add onto that layers of complexity and challenge and hardship and potentially injustice, that situation gets all the harder. And so I started looking at these inflection points and thinking, like I said, if not, then who in those situations? And that's where this all came from.
We're going to talk about Project Rousseau. And at the core of it, there's the mentorship. In your personal life, did you meet a mentor?
I've met too many mentors. I have had so many in my life who have been extraordinary role models in my life. And I think that one thing that is often important to remember is you need not call someone a mentor for them to be one. And a mentor need not be someone who mentors you throughout your life or even in all areas of your life. You can find different mentors in different parts of your lives. I was fortunate to have two parents who I considered mentors. I consider some teachers and particularly professors to be extraordinary mentors. A great mentor not only is someone who gives you great advice, but is also someone who helps you frame your questions better and helps you frame your outlook better. When I finished college, I had a choice about where to go to graduate school before this was my master's degree before law school. I had two choices. I remember asking a lot of people what they thought. And then I met with someone who is an absolute mentor in my life and has been for a long time. He was the first person I spoke to who didn't make a single statement the entire conversation. He only asked questions. And it was interesting because it was very much how I teach, especially, the Oxford tutorial style, where you continue to ask questions and probe at definitions and probe at framing and the valences that you put on your decision-making process. And I left that knowing what I was going to do, not because he had said anything, but because he had helped frame the situation well.
What kind of difference does it make for the listener?
So that's a great question. I think to answer that question through the lens of our mentoring program, mentoring used to be a really formal program that we had, packets for and training systems and so forth. As our student body has grown higher and higher need, as we're targeting a greater percentage of our student population to be newly arrived refugees and, juvenile justice involved young people and unaccompanied homeless minors and so forth, mentorship doesn't need to be just the way we envision mentorship, which was once a week after school, one-to-one in a school building, talking about school. We have these phenomenal activities that we call dinner conversations, which are just conversations. We have, wonderful food donors at a few of our sites, and they make donations of food. And one of the things we use them for is we all have dinner together. And that's particularly important for students from shelters who often are concerned that if they stay here in our offices too late to work, that they might not get home in time for enough food from the shelter staff or volunteers at the shelter. And we often just bring in a guest and tell the guest no script, just talk about your life and ask questions. And some of the ones the kids love the most and find most fulfilling is when they start to ask questions, what would you have told me to do in this situation? Or what would you think about? I remember so clearly we had a person come in and speak whose lifestyle was very different to our students. But he just told a simple story about a conflict he had with a teacher when he was 15 years old. He felt the teacher was unfair to him. And, I don't remember all the details, but roughly that the teacher disliked him for some set of reasons and felt he wasn't hardworking. And he just stopped his story and said, what would you have done in my situation? Or if you were my friend, what would you do? And to open up our students in that sense, it's often, more comfortable to talk about something when it's a third party. They led to great conversations about work ethic and professionalism and how to conduct oneself with an adult. I think that mentorship does so much for the listener when the mentee isn't just listening. When the mentee is driving the conversation, but the mentor is the guide of where it goes. And it's an active experience. One of my second time in Rikers Island 7 or 8 years ago, we had a student of ours who we met before before he was convicted, before he was charged even. And then he had a sentence in Rikers. And I was visiting him, and we were having a conversation about something to do with sports marketing. He loved basketball, and I don't actually remember the exact context of the conversation, but what I recall so vividly is I said something, I'm like, that was a very smart thing to have said. He said, do you think smart things are only said by smart people? And I said, certainly. And he actually, I don't know if he would like it to know that I think he cried, but he certainly was emotional. He was moved. And he said, no one has ever said in my 19 years of living that I'm smart before. it was that colonel that actually, what was phenomenal is his behavior at jail changed significantly. There were some other inmates who he had challenges with from the outside, and he realized he could talk to people who worked in the Department of Corrections and avoid them more, and made really good decisions. And he has a bachelor's degree now. Parole is behind him, and it was that one moment that gave him a kernel of something he could think about. I think it's often about, we talk about this all the time with the staff, activation energy from chemistry is a really helpful analogy. That often, the reason there's an enzyme is because something takes too much energy to get activated. And then once you get to that activation energy, then the reaction happens fully. And I often feel we're that catalyst. And you just need that spark. You need to find that spark as the mentor. And mentors can be in all walks of life. You find that spark, and then the person's brilliance and talent and perseverance takes it from there.
How did you find the spark? I mean, is it by intuition? How did you make the difference? By listening?
Listen is a great place to start. I'll give you
And what does it mean to really listen?
That's a great question. So I feel like I kind of walk through their stories with them as they tell me about their lives until the point that we meet them. I also think, though, it's so important to show that you can be helpful on their own terms very quickly. To move to another student, we had a student who came to us, and he was homeless. He had a significant health challenge that was unmet for quite a few years, very, very life-threatening or near life-threatening, and had some juvenile justice concerns and hadn't been in school in quite a while. Also didn't have food access. Before we leave our first meeting, he has to see that I've been instantly helpful to him somehow. And so we made a proper doctor's appointment. We referred him to a phenomenal care provider who's helped many of our students in his particular city. And we were able to work with a restaurant where we know some folks on him just getting access to some food, and we paid up front for a few meals for him to take it out. And because he wasn't yet at the point he would have felt comfortable in a restaurant, it was better to just take it back to the shelter. But he left thinking, gee, these guys are helpful. And I expressed concerns. And instead of the adult telling me what my concerns should be, they took me on my own terms. They met pressing needs that I have. I think I'm going to die from my health situation. And had it not been addressed, he would have been right. And so we addressed it. And we helped him realize that, when he brings concerns to us, if we tell him that he's not right, it's only because we have developed a fluency in his way of seeing the world and an understanding of what it is that he thinks he needs. And then we marry that with the experience we have, and can help him understand better when he's not right. There's often a problem behind the problem. The reason why kids don't go to school rarely has anything to do with academics. It's not that they're scared they won't do well on the math test, so they don't go to school for 4 months. That's not why they don't go to school for 4 months. It could be one small piece in the larger puzzle, but you have to see the puzzle completed to understand what's going on. And so to listen to the kids on their own terms is really, really important. And that's where it comes from. And that spark comes from these people, even if we don't understand, that we're trying, and kids know when you make a good faith effort and when you don't.
Let's come back to 2011 when you founded Project Rousseau. I would like to know, you were 20 years old?
I was 19.
You were 19 years old. How were you considered by your friends founding this non-profit organization? How did they consider you at the time?
Most of my friends have very different interests than nonprofit work, charity work. I have a certain admiration for friends of mine who go into fields that I know that they're not their passion, and that they're trying to pursue other things, and how they work so hard at it. Because if I didn't find the fulfillment from what I did, I don't know if I could do that. I think that that's a different skill set, and I'm not sure that's something I have. In some ways, I've never had to test it because I haven't been in a situation where I'm doing something professionally that I don't want to do. But one thing I'll say is the organization realistically has grown with me, and in some ways I'm the ceiling, and in other ways I'm not. And I think it's really only been the last year that I'm not a ceiling in places I'm weak. The reason we had no social media presence, no social media marketing, is I'm personally not really on social media. Those sorts of limitations, though minor relative to the work that we do, were always present. And there were other things that were limiting. We do a series of international programs. They all started when I first started traveling internationally myself. I did a master's degree in the UK, and I don't think I fully appreciated what those opportunities meant for someone at a young age. And so I think in many ways, the organization's progression is congruent to my own.
So let's come back to 2011 when you founded Project Rousseau. How did it all start?
The story really goes back to 2010. I had the idea there were really two things that drove Project Rousseau. One was I wanted to help those who were in the highest need. And I don't think I knew what that meant. And maybe I still don't, but just from my academic work and my professional work, I have a better sense of what highest need means now, or what factors are involved at least. And I knew I wanted to provide holistic support. I knew that segmenting services that young people receive leads to less access to those various services. And that's all I really knew. So I first started shopping around existing nonprofits asking, could I kind of pilot this within your organization? And I got really one response, which was grant-making organizations like foundations look at how many young people you help. And that's the metric. The primary metric is volume. If you're proposing the opposite of that, which is to allocate more resources to fewer students rather than distributing resources across more students so you can say you help tens of thousands, then that won't be a good thing for our strategic plan. And I respect that view. I disagree. And I kept shopping it around kind of hopelessly. I must have met with dozens of charities, but just a different outlook was clear. And I was in a meeting with someone who's definitely a mentor, tragically passed away last year, but very much to the extent that one ever says this, kind of a parent away from home in many ways. And he said, I think you're going to have to do this yourself if you want to do this. And I looked up on Google how to start a nonprofit. I was in a college dormitory. I had no idea what I was doing. Started putting together paperwork. And I did the 1023, the form to the IRS after you incorporate. I did the 1023 myself, drafted it. I contacted a lawyer via the university's resources that I attended, Columbia's university resources. And she gave me some pointers. She read through it. She said, yeah, it'll get approved. Here are some changes I would make. She offered to read a second draft. And then I printed it out and mailed it from the campus center where you can send mail. And so it was a lot of piecemeal advice from so many people introducing me to other people. What I think is amazing, and I don't really reflect on this much, so I'm glad this productively forced me into the exercise of thinking so much about that year, 2010, when it was really late 2010, when it was getting off the ground, is that of those people, I would think that I'm still in weekly contact or more frequent of those initial helpers who helped to get off the ground with, I'd say, over 75% of them. And I hadn't thought about it recently until you just asked about them. But they've been phenomenal figures in my life.
So the most powerful component of Project Rousseau is the bond between the student and the mentor. What is required from them to make the mentorship work well?
So mentorship works at its best when the mentor really sees that their commitment is to another person and not to an organization. We have a mentor in Chicago right now. We've actually had a history of phenomenal mentors in Chicago, and there's something about our Chicago mentors that's particularly special. And I don't know if it's because, tragically, we have a lot of student fatalities in Chicago, above our national average by quite a bit, because of the violence on the South Side. But there's something about their commitment that's so incredible. And we had a student there who was in a life or death situation. And I called the mentor, and the mentor said, give me one moment, and took a picture of the number that he got from the police about the reference number for again, I have a lot of restrictions on what I can talk about, but whatever was happening, the information regarding healthcare about where the student was at the time and some other things that were of extraordinary help, and said, I contacted the guardian of the person, which the person lives in a shelter, contacted someone in law enforcement, had been the one to call 911, and said, how can I help from here? And we said, really, it's in the hands of the professionals now. But if you want to go to the hospital to visit, I think that would be really well received once the student is conscious again. Not only did the mentor go, but the mentor thought about, what can I bring each time that the student would like to see? And it turns out that a lot of our students, when they have long recoveries, let's say from gunshot wounds, for example, they really start to crave doing schoolwork in the hospital because they want to feel productive. And I would get text messages on a nurse's phone that the student was using in the hospital saying, my mentor was just here for the last 3.5 hours, and we did work. We watched some TV. We talked about something they have in common, and then my mentor left. And that commitment is to the child. And what's interesting is the ones who are like that see themselves as a conduit.
Would you say that mentorship is something that doesn't need to be learned? How do you see that? Because it's at the core of your project.
Yeah, it's a good question. And what I'll say is, I think the answer is yes, but I think what I think might not be as intuitive is from who you learn it. I think you learn it from the mentees, not from other mentors, or at least equally from mentees and mentors. I remember that some of the best advice I've ever gotten about how to handle a situation with a student came from the inspiration of what another student helps me realize.
So it's about learning by example.
Yeah, it's learning by example. And then also realizing once again that, it comes in pieces. We work with a number of homeless shelters, and there are a handful in particular where we really admire the way they approach homelessness. The idea of not having roots is really degrading for a person, to not feel like they're home somewhere. And I remember one of our partner shelters is a place where the person who runs it was himself a client of the shelter at one point. And he told me so much about how degrading it was simply that no one would smile at you when you're on the street. And he said, people smile at each other when they run into each other on the street, and they don't smile at me. And he said that was one of those deep-cutting things that he remembers most about when he was a street-dwelling homeless person. One of the things that we've learned a lot about mentorship, be it with our mentor volunteers or just as staff members to each other, to our students, to our volunteers as well, is it's not just what they can learn from you. In fact, that might be a minority of what's helpful. A majority of what's helpful is you helping them understand how they can learn from other people and other experiences and other things.
Rousseau saw the properly designed education as an emancipatory process. Do you think that competition in education is compatible with personal emancipation?
Interesting. That's an interesting question. I think the answer is yes. I also think that broad statements about education are often going to be wrong for a broad...
Yes means it's compatible.
Yes, it's compatible. One of our more interesting debates is about standardized testing in the United States. We are in a position where you would think we are the strongest opponents of standardized testing because it doesn't serve our population well. And we feel precisely the opposite. There is nothing better than having, let's say, an SAT score, a key test in our state, in our country, or, we work with younger populations on other tests, and they get a number, and then they work with us for a period of time, and then they get another number. And when that second number is higher than the first number, that means so much more to a child than saying you're doing well, because they can see that the number increased. They can see the improvement for themselves. Quantifying their progress is really hard, and it is absolutely the case that an SHSAT score, an SSAT score, ACT score, all these tests, they're completely arbitrary standards. I couldn't agree more. But to know that that number got higher is an extraordinary thing. And there's nothing wrong with creating measuring sticks that people can use to decide if they're improving and to be inwardly and outwardly competitive. The final thing I'll say is, one thing that we always ask of people who say, well, you should want to get rid of those measuring sticks is, well, what would you propose as a tool of evaluation otherwise? It would just be another measuring stick. And maybe it'll be a little bit less arbitrary than the one we currently use. I doubt that. I think that all that assessment history has been is just replacing one arbitrary tool of assessment with another.
What you say is that evaluations mean competitions in a way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. Competition's not the right word for what I'm about to talk about, but sometimes competition is just an externalized form of intrinsic motivation, and it's just how it gets expressed. I think always you're doing it for yourself on some level. So I don't think competition is incompatible with emancipation. And, Rousseau obviously had an immense impact on how I think. He didn't quite think about the Industrial Revolution, and so didn't think about population scale. And so there are so many gems from how he thinks and how he wrote about education that I have found so helpful, hence the name of the organization. But by no means is it the only one. And one of the things I'll just say as well is one of our great things is that we have some curriculum development we've done that's actually based on professional development curricula at banks that sponsor us. And you would never think that some Wall Street bank or Canary Wharf bank in London or what have you would have insight on educating primary school children, but they do. And professional development is itself a form of education. It's a very different type, but there are a lot of similarities, and we try and learn from that. Sometimes people ask me, when do you know when a staff member is successful? It's when there's that ability to learn from interactions that they have, to learn from our history, the willingness to learn from our history and the eagerness to learn from our history, but also the eagerness to learn from the exposures that they get through our work.
There's a question that comes to mind right now. It's about Rousseau himself. Despite his ideal of education, he abandoned his children. What do you think about the gap between Rousseau's philosophical ideal and his personal life?
Right.
It's something that speaks to everyone who are involved in education.
Yeah. So 2 things. First is I have learned through my work and through my life not to pass judgment on people who I've not met. And so I find it hard to stomach that someone in his position would have treated his own children like that. I find it very hard to reconcile with what I admire of his ideology. But I also think that it's such an important reminder. One thing I think about a lot is when I have a family of my own one day, that I often talk about Project Rousseau's kids as kind of my kids or the kids I work with or something like that. But when I actually have those myself, I have to think about what that means in the context of Project Rousseau. I think about that very frequently, actually. Very, very frequently. I had this realization. I have a very dear friend, a couple of great friends, group of them bring their kids to some of our volunteer programs. And what I realized is I said something like, to this person whose daughter graduated from college a year or so ago. And I was talking to him, like, one day I'm going to be bringing my kids to these things. And he said something like, yeah, and then you won't be able to talk to all the other kids as much because at least half your time is going to be with your own child. And I kind of had this realization that I would hope he's right. And I can't give Rousseau credit that he's the reason I thought about all that because I don't think that's right. But it definitely adds to that sense of urgency. I didn't know this actually for a very long time. I learned, so Project Rousseau was founded in 2011. And we formed a partnership with a women's empowerment charity in 2014 or 15. And they had written an article on their website about it. And we shared that article on our social media. And someone just commented like, why would a women's empowerment charity partner with someone whose organization is named after a man like Jean-Jacques Rousseau? And that person really affected the way I thought about it. I never thought about changing the name of the organization or anything like that. Despite a lot of pressure to change the name of the organization from marketing people who, are donors of ours or advise us and say, it doesn't tell you anything about what the organization does. I always say, on the contrary, it's a perfect entree into how I think about the organization and our work and our students. And so I think in some ways it's the best conversation starter we could hope for as an organization. Second thing I'll say about it is Brian Stevenson always says we're better than our worst moments. I know of people. I'm a very private person, but I've said my family came here after the Holocaust. I know stories of people who did things that an objective observer would consider reprehensible and, got other people sent to camps or something like that. I think that if we all learn not to judge by those circumstances, we'll all be better off for it and instead looking at it as a learning opportunity. We have a lot of students who have to learn from experiences with the justice system, either their own or other students or family members. Well, actually, a story. I remember a student who really struggled with a relationship with a parent. Is as a child, an infant or a toddler, relatively young child, their mother traded them for cocaine to fuel her cocaine addiction. And we have quite a few students who have a story something like that. The student said something like, I can't reconcile this. It was a really helpful experience, but it brought me back to the way I helped that student and the way that student helped me comes back to the first time I ever had this experience. We have a student whose father killed his mother, and he was there. He watched the whole thing. His first line of his college essay was, when it's quiet in a room, I still hear my mom begging for her life. And then his father died in a prison fight a few years later. And he learned about the prison fight before I did. We weren't very sophisticated back then. We weren't plugged into the justice system. We wouldn't have learned it before him. And he comes to tell me the news. And I start to give him my sympathies. And he says, sympathy? I'm elated my mother's death has been avenged. Understandably. A few days later, he comes back to me and says, when my dad was bludgeoning my mother to death, he was laughing. And so he was happy my mom died. So if I'm happy he died, does that mean I'm no better than he is? Interpersonal comparison of utility and moral equivalency, Kant couldn't figure it out. He's asking questions that, like I said, Kant and the rest of the Enlightenment thinkers couldn't solve. That was kind of the foundation on which I laid a lot of this thinking. So going back to the young woman with the mother who traded her, and, she said, I said something to her along the lines of, do you know what situation your mother was in? And she said, I wonder if she thought the people in the cartel were going to kill her. And my whole life I never thought about that, because I just thought about how could you sell me? And I think there's something so enriching and helpful to that perspective that we never quite understand what people are going through. You asked about how Project Rousseau got started. The year before, when I applied to university, the first line of my college essay was a quote from Philo the Jew, as he's often called, an ancient Greek philosopher, who, depending on how you translate it, said something along the lines of, be kind, for every man you meet is fighting a great battle. And it's a phenomenal perspective to have on our work, because you never know what battles young people bring into our doors.
That's the last stage of the interview. I'm gonna leave the room. Please take the microphone and add whatever you want to the interview.
Wonderful. So, thoughts. First of all, Philippe is just such a dear friend. I think one of the things that I appreciate most about this interview, even though we haven't even discussed it at all, is how we met. We met a month ago, or over a month ago, through a dear friend who's, I believe, has been one of your other interview subjects. It's been such a phenomenal experience getting to know you and hearing about your work and thinking about Sounds Like Portraits, and remembering that, we have such great commonalities with each other. And even though on paper our professions are no different, we're both people who help other people learn. And I think that's, when you think about it at that level, it is really enriching to think about, and to remind our young people who we work with that there's always something that can be learned from everyone you meet. So this has been as much of a learning experience for me as for anyone else. And I think my closing thought will just be that, like I said earlier about how I think that mentors are often about asking the right questions and guiding the thinking of the person, you asked me questions I hadn't thought about before. And so it was very enriching for me, incredibly enriching for me. And I appreciate you stopping by, and know that we'll be continuing the conversation past this particular episode of our conversation for a long time to come. Thank you again.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your story. And thank you, Dominic Bruceline-Bobs, for introducing me to Andrew. Happy holidays to all. It was Sounds Like Portraits, a podcast by Philippe Ungar. Please visit soundslikeportraits.com, and if you like this show, don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, or Google Podcast. And remember to leave us your comment and rating. It really helps new listeners find us. Thank you. Music Charmeuse de Serpent, composed and conducted by Olivier Glisson. See you soon for the next episode.